Like beer, wine has enjoyed a long and prosperous history. It's been enjoyed by the ancients, used as a safe alternative to water, prescribed as medicine and offered in ritual. And like beer, wine also has patron deities from a range of cultures. But how does it appear across mythology and folklore? What are its links to witchcraft and apotropaic magic? Well, let's find out in this week's episode of Fabulous Folklore. Hello there and welcome to Fabulous Folklore, the podcast for all things folklore, occult and just a bit weird. I'm your host Icy Sedgwick, blogger, fantasy author and your guide into these rather mysterious realms. I've got some rare things to show you, so come on in, take a look around, but be careful not to touch anything. These things sometimes bite. Well, hello there and welcome back to Fabulous Folklore with me, your host, Icy Sedgwick. I hope that your Easter weekend is going well. Just as a very, very brief reminder that I am doing a talk in conjunction with Cresswell Crags again online on Monday at 6 p.m. British Summer Time about Easter folklore and sort of where quite a lot of Easter things have come from. And in researching this talk, I've learned a lot more about hot cross buns than I ever thought I needed to know. So if you are interested in that, then I have put the link in the show notes, as long as you obviously listen to that before Monday. If you're listening to this after Monday, I dare say there's probably a replay kicking around somewhere. But we are continuing this week with the folklore of wine, which is the third in our folklore of drinks series after we did beer and tea. And again, this one has proved to be a little bit difficult for me as I don't drink. But it was quite funny when I started researching it because I thought, oh no, there's actually not that much about it. And then I ended up falling down a rabbit hole, as one does. And then thus here is this episode. So as always, it does actually take between 4 and 6 hours to actually put together the blog post and the podcast episode. So if you would like to help support my time in making these episodes for you, then you can obviously leave me a review, you can buy me a coffee, or you can join the Fabulous Folklore family on Patreon and also get extra benefits as well. So just leaving that out there. But let's have a look at wine in folklore and mythology, shall we? And it would be incredibly remiss of me, indeed, to do anything to do with wine and to not mention Dionysus and Bacchus. Now, Dionysus was the Greek god of the grape harvest, wine, fertility, religious ecstasy and theatre, among other things. And we don't have the time to go into the many and often contradictory stories about Dionysus, including his parentage and all that kind of thing. But suffice it to say, he was the son of Zeus, and at one point he did marry Ariadne, who was the princess who helped Theseus through the labyrinth. He's one of the most often represented gods in Greek art, and he's sometimes listed as one of the 12 Olympian gods. Now, other lists do feature Hestia instead, the goddess of hearth and home, and while later scholars have interpreted this to mean that Hestia gave up her seat for Dionysus, there's no ancient myth to support this, so we don't really know why the lists kind of alternate in between which one is an Olympian and which one isn't. But Dionysus does appear in certain myths which do dovetail with other things that we've covered here on the podcast, and indeed I think we all know how much I love looking at things to do with the stars, and Dionysus is actually related to one of the constellation myths. And in this particular myth, Dionysus taught Icarius how to make wine, because that's kind of the sort of thing that Dionysus does. And trying to share the joy, Icarius then shared his new produce with his neighbours. When they got drunk, obviously not knowing what drunkenness felt like because it was new to them, they wrongly assumed that he'd poisoned them, and then in a fit of anger, obviously which you could associate with drunkenness, then killed Icarius. His daughter Erigone then found his body and killed herself as well, and Dionysus, who is not sure if he was furious about it or was just feeling bad for his part in the process, turned them into constellations. So Erigone actually became the constellation of Virgo, and Icarius became the Boots constellation. And indeed, Erigone's dog Mera actually became the star Procyon, which is the super bright star in Canis Minor, which is the smaller one next to Canis Major, which obviously you would recognise as being the constellation that houses Sirius. Now, Bacchus, on the other hand, is a somewhat confusing figure because the Romans essentially adopted Dionysus and then renamed him as Bacchus, and some think that his name came from the Greek Bacchos, which is one of the other names for Dionysus. And the Romans actually saw Bacchus as being a form of kind of spontaneous inspiration, so once people were drunk, they could then access creativity or new ways of thinking. But the reason why it's confusing is because Rome already had Liber, sometimes known as Liber Pater, who was the god of viticulture and wine. And like many of the Roman deities, he actually appeared in earlier Italian cults before he was sort of adopted officially by the Republic. And the Romans essentially adopted him alongside the establishment of the Republic, and he became part of what's known as the Aventine triad with Ceres and Libera. And over time, Liber was identified with Bacchus and Libera was identified with Proserpina. And if you're familiar with Greek mythology, Ceres is Demeter and Proserpina is Persephone. So you can sort of see how they then created this new triad in opposition to the Capitoline triad, which was Jupiter, Mars and Quirinus. Now, the Romans held Liber's festival, the Liberalia, on March 17th. And Liber in Latin actually means free, so you get quite a lot of ideas of freedom and free speech popping up around the Liberalia. Farmers would actually offer Liber the first pressing of the grape harvest in thanks of his help in being able to grow it as well. Since Liber was the patron of the plebeian class, and as a reminder, that's the largest class but they're the least politically powerful, the wine produced for him was fit for non-religious consumption because obviously they're not part of the elite. So obviously the deity associated with them then is basically associated with like mundane wine, if that makes sense. So the wine made for him couldn't be used for religious ceremonies because it was considered impure. So if you wanted to make ritual wine as an offering to the god, then you had to take the best grapes and then press those under Jupiter's patronage before they were then purified for religious use. So it's quite interesting how you then see this kind of dual aspect of Jupiter and Liber both being related to wine and growing grapes and harvest and things, but in two different ways. But then what then also complicates matters is the Romans also originally celebrated the Bacchanalia to honour Bacchus. And there are actually very few sources which explain what actually happened at the Bacchanalia, although it does seem to appear that they were mostly held in the countryside. But they must have been so raucous that in the early 2nd century BCE, the government actually limited the Bacchanalia to try and bring these wild events under control. And in some cases, Bacchus replaces Liber and the Bacchanalia becomes part of the Liberalia. And then in other places, sort of Liber, Bacchus and Dionysus largely become interchangeable. So you do have these different patron deities of wine who have different backstories, but who ultimately all represent the same thing. Now, one of the main reasons why I'm bringing up mythology is its continuing influence elsewhere. And this is the thing I think that you get with mythology and folklore. It constantly references itself through other means. And it's always surprising when it kind of pops up in weird places like the British Isles, for example, in the 13th century. So in 1282, during Easter week, Inverkeithing's parish priest decided to resurrect some of these ancient rituals. So he then gathered young girls from the local villages and made them dance in circles, which was apparently in honour of Father Bacchus. And then he also led the dance while carrying a pole which bore a replica of human reproductive organs. And according to some sources, people would do things like that at Dionysian rituals as well. Dionysus was very popular with groups like the Hellfire Club in the 18th century because by this point he'd largely come to represent unfettered sexuality, pleasure and hedonism. Now, surprisingly, deadly nightshade was actually associated with the ancient cult of Dionysus, and according to the Royal College of Physicians in Edinburgh, priests would add deadly nightshade to drinks to induce trances in worshippers. I've no idea if the Reconstructionists also did this, but I certainly hope that they didn't. But there again, Dionysus has also gone on to influence both albums and songs by bands like Dead Can Dance and BTS, which I think is something that he would definitely approve of. Now we're going to make that leap from mythology to more wide folklore, but we're going to stay in Italy for this one because this is where we're going to have a look at the link between wine and witchcraft. Because in northern Italy, people actually fear the interference of so-called bad witches with their wine. And these witches would apparently pee in bottles and barrels and basically spoil the grape harvest. But wine producers had a way of fighting back. And this was the Benandanti, so-called good witches, who would battle against the bad witches. Now, you could identify a Benandante since they were what we would call born in the caul, and that's when the amniotic sac that holds the infant in the womb, part of it then becomes wrapped around the baby. And indeed, that's the thing that people would then sell the caul because it was supposed to prevent you from drowning at sea. Now, a male Benandante, because it was only the men who were allowed to do this, would go into a trance and shapeshift in order to fight the bad witches. The Benandante would be armed with fennel stalks and the witches would be armed with sorghum, and then they would essentially kind of thrash each other with these crops. Now, if you didn't have any benandante to provide help, you would need to leave a bowl of water outside your home, because this would somehow ward off the bad witches unless the bowl tipped over or was spoiled in a storm. Now, these fights between the benandante and the witches happened 4 times a year, and a victory for the witches meant withered crops, sick animals and ruined wine, whereas a win for the benandante basically meant a nice, happy, abundant, safe season ahead for all concerned. Now, surprisingly, the Inquisition actually investigated the benandante and eventually described them as being benign magic rather than satanic, and they didn't execute the benandante. But the problem is, because they initially deemed them heretics, the villagers eventually turned against them. And over time, the cult died out, and then people were basically left to fend for themselves. But obviously the links between wine and witchcraft continue, because as we saw in the episode with beer, we do have this confusion sometimes between witchcraft and herbcraft that Michael Osling talked about in relation to Poland. And what's quite interesting is the way some of the witches' herbs appear in trial records in Poland do actually relate to wine. And what's quite interesting is the way that wine is then used as the basis for 2 beverages to fend off witchcraft. And for the first one, you mix St. John's wort seeds, snapdragon and wintergreen with wine, and that's supposed to counteract witchcraft. And that one actually makes quite a lot of sense, because people did believe that snapdragons could protect against witchcraft and curses. And then the second one requires you to make a tincture of peony and mugwort with wine to chase away witchcraft and all enchantment. And again, that one does make a lot of sense, although given the use of mugwort in witchcraft, I do find that a really interesting ingredient to include. And of course, we can't actually talk about wine and witchcraft without mentioning witch bottles. And I've obviously got a whole episode about witch bottles, which I will link below. But as a brief reminder, people basically think that witch bottles acted as a form of apotropaic magic. And I love saying the word apotropaic. It's just such a fun word to say. But you would basically make a witch bottle and then bury it on your property to counteract any witchcraft that might be done against you. These bottles were usually made of some kind of ceramic material or glass, and they might contain fingernail clippings, pins, nails, broken glass, hair and urine, among other things. And the funny thing is, in 2016, someone actually brought a wine bottle to the Antiques Roadshow on BBC, and they'd essentially found it underground and upside down, which straight away, to any of you lot, you would go, oh my god, that's a witch bottle. But this person was like, ooh, it's just an antique wine bottle, I'm going to see how much it's worth on the telly. So the appraiser assumed it contained wine or port because of the shape of the bottle, and then actually tasted a droplet of it and just said, yes, it is definitely wine, although I'm tasting some rust in there as well. How we knew what rust tasted like, I don't know, but this is the way that the episode went. Now later, Dr. Massey at Loughborough University actually analysed the bottle's contents. And in 2019, Antiques Roadshow then reunited the bottle's owner and the appraiser to share what they'd found. And yes, it was a witch bottle, and it contained alcohol, brass pins, human hair, a crustacean, and urine. Now, Dr. Massey didn't specify that the alcohol was wine, but indeed, if you look for recipes for making witch bottles online, the modern versions often recommend red wine as a base ingredient. And I think it's one of those things where I'm not entirely sure how much ordinary people might have used red wine in earlier centuries due to the cost of it, but it does make quite a good symbolic alternative to blood if you want to use something that looks like bodily fluids. Obviously, urine's much easier to come by. But of course, wine itself, as I say, has this almost like visual representation as blood, but it also has various attributes that make it compatible with medicine, such as its ethanol content. And this is where we can then start to look at it as being a medicinal beverage rather than something to be used in apotropaic magic. Now, the ancient Sumerians actually left recipes for medicine made using wine on clay tablets, which date to between 2200 and 2100 BCE. The Egyptians also used wine as a medicine, and they've used it for both internal concoctions but also external things. So they might do things like soak bandages in it to help reduce swelling and also promote the healing of wounds. In ancient India, Vedic medical texts also describe the medicinal attributes of wine, and historians think that Alexander the Great might have brought some of this medical knowledge back to Europe after he invaded India in 327 BCE. And Jewish and Arabic doctors also advocated wine as a medical tool. And I'm including all of this just to show that it's really easy, I think, for us to kind of centre Europe as the source of all of these magical things and marvellous things. But actually, in a lot of cases, they come from other parts of the world. So, credit where credit's due. And if you are interested in this, there is a fantastic article about this by Geoffrey Crawford, which I have linked in the blog post, which is in the show notes below. But obviously, it's not just the ancient world that relied on wine as a medical remedy, because in 1898, 3 million litres of wine was actually served in hospitals in Paris. Now, it is quite interesting because originally wine was sold as a health cure by apothecaries, but eventually the drinking of alcohol for social reasons rather than nutritional health did increase from the late 16th century onwards. And yes, beer and ale were still the preferred beverages, which obviously we looked at a couple of weeks ago, because wine was more expensive ultimately. And because it was an imported item, customs taxes meant that innkeepers would often push up the price. However, by around about 1649, people were starting to drink it recreationally. And this led to a really, really weird situation in which you had writers and musicians who were composing content aplenty, praising wine and its many virtues, but then the government and religious bodies were having this series of moral panics about the problems of heavy drinking. So it's how do you kind of reconcile those two things? And there was even an English Civil War division between the aristocratic wine favoured by the royalists and the beer preferred by the lowly republicans. And I think in some ways that definition between the two kind of does seem like it's still in evidence in a way. But a range of changes at the end of the 19th century saw wine replaced by pharmaceuticals. But at the same time, wine did remain a medicinal remedy in its own way, especially when it was made from ingredients other than grapes. So as one example, hot elderflower tea or elderberry wine in particular is still said to combat cold and flu symptoms. Now we're going to finish up this episode with the superstitions that have clung to wine over the years. And I was actually quite surprised that a lot of these are not necessarily about wine itself. But the first one is that winemakers apparently hung masks of Dionysus from their trees in their vineyard, and these would then move in the wind, and they would grant fruitfulness to whichever part of the vineyard they faced. And one German superstition sees farmers bring the final grape harvest home in an ox-pulled cart, because if they don't, the whole harvest will turn sour. And other people think that when someone dies, you must go down to their wine cellar and shake any wine that's down there, because otherwise it'll turn to vinegar. Which is an interesting one, because normally when you look at death superstitions, it's about things like going and telling the bees, or hanging cloths over the mirrors, or stopping the clocks or whatever. But very few people mention this one about shaking wine that they happen to have in a wine cellar. The Romans considered spilled wine a bad omen of impending disaster, potentially because it might have actually offended Liber or Bacchus. But if you spill wine in Italy now, make sure you dab some of it behind your ears to avoid bad luck. Don't toast with any vessel not made of glass. So if you're not using glasses and say you're, for whatever reason, drinking out of like plastic cups or tin mugs or whatever, touch your knuckles together rather than bashing together other receptacles. And when you're toasting lots of people at once, don't like cross arms and cross glasses with people. Instead, take it in turns to simply toast with the person opposite you, otherwise it brings bad luck. Finally, you shouldn't toast with water, and what you should basically do is you should either add a single drop of wine to your water or just simply toast with something else. And some people think that this is actually an American superstition because the US Navy urged people not to toast with water while at sea because water returns to water, and therefore they thought it was a bad omen as well. Obviously, if you're me, I mean, I've quite openly toasted with grape juice, with lemonade, and even with coffee, so it doesn't necessarily have to just be, wine or water with wine in it. And also never pour your wine backhanded or you'll bring bad luck. And this one makes the most sense to me out of all of them, because it's actually how poisoners would have flicked poison into wine in centuries gone by, because they would have worn these big rings that you can just flick open, you would have dropped the poison in and nobody would have been any the wiser. So what do we make of the folklore of wine? Well, like I said, there's surprisingly little direct folklore about wine other than its appearance in tales of witchcraft, or indeed its status alongside gods like Dionysus and Bacchus. And in part, this might be because wine is considered such a helpful drink that it's almost too normal to have any folklore. And instead, if you look at it, a lot of the superstitions relate to either the practice of toasting or indeed the harvest rather than the wine itself. But remember, if you take away nothing else from this episode, just remember that if you find an old glass bottle on your property containing what looks like wine, don't taste it because it might not be. And I think that's fairly good life advice. If you find something weird, don't start licking it. But there we go. I hope you enjoyed that episode. I actually quite enjoyed it once I got into it, because I suddenly realised there was a lot more to it than just simply these superstitions about toasting and things like that. Next week we are going to move on to coffee because that one just made sense. And then I think we are going to finish off the month with cider because there's more to find about that. And then we can look at things like the practice of wassailing and so on, which I've referred to a couple of times, but not really in a huge amount of detail. So we'll be able to have a look at that in the final week. If you are a Patreon supporter, then obviously I am in the process of making all of the different bonuses and things like that. So you should already have this month's storytelling episode, which is the legend of Madam Pigott, or how to banish a ghost into a bottle, and everything else will be coming across the rest of the month as well, including an exclusive article on St. George and his origins in time for St. George's Day. So as I say, I hope you enjoyed that. I have no idea if you can hear the bird that's currently singing outside my window. I hope you can, because it's quite sweet. I hope that you have a marvellous Easter weekend, and hopefully I will see you next week for the folklore around coffee. Cheerio. Well, thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoyed that episode. If you did, feel free to leave a review wherever you listen to podcasts, because that helps other people find the show too. It also takes between 4 and 6 hours to research, write, record and edit these episodes, so if you want to help support my time in doing that, then you can buy me a coffee. Or you can join the Fabulous Folklore family on Patreon and enjoy extra benefits, including exclusive episodes and articles and even illustrated talks. All the links you need are below, and thanks in advance.